The motion sensor pinged at 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, the third time that week. Daniel Foster, a 42-year-old software engineer who worked from home, looked up from his laptop to see 3 children splashing in his pool. Again. Their mother, Rebecca Hartley, reclined on his deck chair, phone in hand, acting as if his backyard was a community park. 5 weeks of this nightmare. 5 weeks of finding wet towels on his furniture, empty juice boxes in his landscaping, and chlorine levels depleted from unauthorized swimmers. Daniel had asked nicely. He'd called the police twice. He'd even put up additional fencing. But Rebecca just laughed, claiming he was being selfish with an empty pool. Today, though, everything was about to change. Because what Rebecca didn't know was that Daniel had spent the last 10 days building an airtight legal case, and today was the day he'd spring the trap. Before we dive into how Daniel turned entitled trespassers into defendants facing real consequences, if you love stories where patience and preparation defeat entitlement, smash that like button and subscribe for more justice served cold. Now let's see exactly how a quiet engineer became a legal nightmare. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that transformed a peaceful man into a strategist, the confrontation where documentation became weaponry, and the resolution where the legal system finally protected the victim instead of the aggressor. The first outline reveals the emotional erosion of having your property treated as public space. Daniel's initial politeness gave way to frustration as Rebecca escalated from apologetic trespasser to entitled neighbor who believed his resources were hers to command. The breaking point wasn't just another intrusion. It was the moment Daniel realized that being reasonable with unreasonable people was enabling their behavior. His methodical mind, trained by years of debugging complex systems, began treating this problem like corrupted code that needed complete rewriting. The second outline chronicles the confrontation that stripped away Rebecca's confidence. When Daniel finally revealed what he'd been documenting, her smug certainty crumbled. The security footage, the time-stamped photographs, the correspondence with attorneys, every piece of evidence she'd ignored while assuming he was powerless, became the bars of a legal cage closing around her. The woman who'd laughed at his requests suddenly found herself facing a homeowner who spoke in statute numbers and filing deadlines. The third outline delivers the resolution, where justice arrived not through dramatic confrontation but through systematic legal pressure. Rebecca discovered that dismissing someone as uptight doesn't protect you when that person has ironclad documentation and the patience to pursue every available remedy. The consequences rippled through her family, her finances, and her standing in the neighborhood, teaching a lesson that politeness had failed to convey. Here's exactly how it happened. Daniel Foster had purchased the 4-bedroom colonial on Maple Ridge Drive 3 years earlier, specifically choosing the property for its privacy and the Olympic-sized pool that occupied most of the backyard. As a remote software engineer for a cybersecurity firm, Daniel valued peace. His days involved 8 to 10 hours of intense concentration, debugging encryption protocols and writing code that protected financial institutions. The pool represented his escape. Evening laps that cleared his mind, weekend mornings spent floating while reading technical journals. He'd invested $12,000 the previous summer renovating the pool area, installing new decking, upgrading the filtration system, and adding privacy fencing that transformed the space into a personal sanctuary. Rebecca Hartley had moved in next door that April with her 3 children. Mason, 11, Olivia, 9, and Cooper, 7. The first incident happened on a Saturday in late May, just 2 weeks after she'd unpacked. Daniel had been inside when he heard splashing. Looking out his kitchen window, he saw Rebecca's children in his pool, screaming and cannonballing, while Rebecca herself sat on his deck furniture, scrolling through her phone. His initial reaction was confusion rather than anger. Perhaps she'd assumed the previous owners had given permission, or maybe she thought the properties shared the pool somehow. He walked outside with a friendly smile, introducing himself and gently explaining that this was his private pool. Rebecca looked up, genuinely surprised, and apologized profusely. She explained she'd just assumed, incorrectly, that the community had pool access, and she'd been so overwhelmed with the move. Daniel, naturally conflict-averse and sympathetic to the chaos of relocation, accepted her apology. She gathered her children, who complained loudly, and left. Daniel figured that was the end of it. He was wrong. The second incident happened 9 days later, on a Thursday afternoon while Daniel was in a critical video conference with clients in Singapore. The motion sensor alert interrupted his presentation. Through his office window, he could see Mason and Cooper diving into his pool while Olivia set up pool toys. His pool toys, taken from his storage shed. This time, Rebecca wasn't even present. Daniel's frustration built, but he was trapped on the call. By the time the meeting ended 2 hours later, the children had left, leaving behind wet towels, muddy footprints across his pristine decking, and a floating pool thermometer cracked in half. That evening, Daniel walked to Rebecca's house and knocked. She answered, holding a glass of wine, music playing behind her. When he explained what had happened, her apology felt performative. She promised to talk to her kids, offered to replace the thermometer, which cost $8 but wasn't the point, and suggested maybe he should keep his gate locked if he was that worried about it. The comment stung, shifting responsibility from her failure to supervise her children to his failure to fortress his own property. Still, Daniel tried to be understanding. Single mother, 3 energetic kids, probably exhausted. He accepted her promise and left. The third incident shattered any remaining goodwill. 3 weeks later, on a brutally hot July afternoon, Daniel came home from a rare office visit to find all 3 children in his pool, and Rebecca herself now swimming, wearing a bikini and sipping what appeared to be a margarita in his pool float. His pool supplies were scattered across the deck. His carefully maintained chemical balance was disrupted by sunscreen and chlorine-depleting bodies. Most infuriating was the sense of violation, the brazen entitlement of a woman treating his property like her personal resort. This time, Daniel didn't knock on her door. He stood at his own fence and called out firmly, demanding they leave immediately. Rebecca barely looked up, waving dismissively and calling back that she'd be done in 20 minutes and he needed to learn to share. Her children laughed. Mason made a comment about Daniel being a grumpy old man. Humiliated and furious, Daniel went inside and called the police. The responding officer was professional but ultimately unhelpful. He spoke with Rebecca, who claimed Daniel had previously given implied permission by not adequately securing his property. The officer suggested Daniel install better locks and perhaps work things out neighborly. No citations were issued. No trespassing report was filed. Daniel watched from his window as Rebecca smirked while talking to the officer, gesturing at his house with theatrical exasperation. When the police left, she returned to his pool for another 15 minutes before finally gathering her children. That night, Daniel lay awake, staring at his ceiling, something hardening in his chest. He'd been reasonable. He'd been kind. He'd followed proper channels. And all of it had been interpreted as weakness. Rebecca wasn't going to stop because she didn't believe there would be consequences. The police weren't going to help because they viewed it as a civil nuisance. If Daniel wanted his property and peace back, he'd have to take them back himself. He spent the weekend researching property law, trespassing statutes, civil remedies, restraining orders, small claims procedures. By Monday morning, Daniel had a plan. He ordered 4 additional security cameras with cloud backup, motion-activated recording, and timestamp capabilities. He documented every previous incident in a detailed timeline with photographs of damage. He researched Rebecca's background, discovered she was a real estate agent, making her willful ignorance of property rights particularly egregious. And he waited, cameras positioned, documentation ready. If Rebecca wanted to play games with his property, Daniel would show her exactly what games looked like when played by someone with patience, intelligence, and the law on his side. The trap sprang on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 11 days after Daniel had completed his preparations. The motion sensors alerted him at 2:43 p.m. Daniel watched his monitor as Rebecca's Tesla pulled into her driveway, her children spilling out still in their school clothes. Within 8 minutes, Mason had vaulted the fence, followed by Olivia and Cooper. Rebecca appeared moments later carrying towels and a cooler, letting herself through Daniel's gate as if she owned it. Daniel had positioned himself in his home office with a clear view of the backyard and his documentation folder open on his desk. He watched them settle in, children shrieking in the water, Rebecca spreading out on his lounge chair with her phone and what appeared to be white wine in a tumbler. He let them get comfortable, let them believe once again that Daniel was either not home or too passive to confront them. Then, at precisely 3 p.m., he walked outside. The sliding door's distinctive sound made Rebecca glance up. She didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. Instead, she smiled lazily and raised her glass in greeting. "Hey, Daniel!" "Don't worry, we'll just be an hour or so. It's so hot today." Her tone was friendly, as if they'd established some routine arrangement. Daniel stopped at the edge of the pool deck, hands in his pockets, voice calm. "Rebecca Marie Hartley, 1247 Maple Ridge Drive, born February 14th, 1983. Your children, Mason James, Olivia Grace, and Cooper William. I need all of you out of my pool immediately, and I need you to remain here for 5 minutes while I explain what happens next." The shift was immediate. Rebecca's smile froze, confusion flickering across her face. "What? How do you—" She sat up, suddenly wary. The children, sensing the change in atmosphere, went quiet in the water. Daniel continued, his voice level but carrying an edge that hadn't been there in previous encounters. "I know everything, Rebecca. I know you're a licensed real estate agent with Berkshire Residential, which means you absolutely understand property rights and trespassing laws. I know Mason attends Franklin Middle School and has soccer practice Tuesday and Thursday evenings. I know Olivia takes dance at Studio 7 on Saturdays. I know Cooper goes to Riverside Elementary. I know your ex-husband, Thomas Hartley, lives in Seattle and pays child support but has minimal custody. And I know that over the past 5 weeks, you and your children have trespassed on my property without permission at least 8 documented times, causing approximately $700 in damage and chemical supply depletion." Rebecca stood now, her face flushing. "You've been, stalking us? That's creepy, Daniel. We're just using a pool, you're not even—" "I've been documenting," Daniel interrupted quietly. "Public records for most of it. School directories. Your own social media accounts, which are remarkably indiscreet. The rest is simple observation from my own property, watching people violate my property. There's nothing creepy about protecting myself with information when dealing with someone who refuses to respect boundaries." He pulled out his phone, turned it toward her, and played a compilation video. Footage from multiple angles showed Rebecca and her children entering his yard, using his pool, leaving debris, damaging property. Timestamps and dates marked each clip. Rebecca watched, her confident posture crumbling. "I have 47 minutes of high-definition video evidence," Daniel said. "Time-stamped, cloud-backed up, documented with corresponding damage reports and receipts for repairs and chemicals. I have photographs of every mess, every broken item, every disruption. I have my phone records showing calls to police. I have written records of every verbal conversation we've had, including your dismissive responses. And I spent yesterday afternoon with an attorney who specializes in property law. Rebecca's voice came out smaller now. Daniel, look, I'm sorry if we've been... I didn't think you'd... You didn't think I'd defend my property? Daniel's calm tone made the question more cutting than anger would have. Here's what's going to happen. You have two options. Option 1. I file a restraining order tomorrow morning. My attorney has already prepared the paperwork. The video evidence alone guarantees approval. That restraining order will prohibit you and your children from coming within 50 feet of my property. Violation of a restraining order is a criminal offense, Rebecca. It goes on permanent record. For a real estate agent, that kind of record can affect licensing. It certainly affects custody arrangements when a parent demonstrates inability to teach children to respect legal boundaries. Rebecca's face went pale. You can't. That's extreme for just... Additionally, Daniel continued as if she hadn't spoken, I file in small claims court for property damage, trespassing compensation, and restoration costs. $700 documented plus filing fees. I win. My attorney guarantees it. That's a judgment on your record. Then I file formal trespassing reports with the police department for every documented incident. 8 separate reports. Create a pattern of behavior. Make sure every future call is taken seriously because there's established history. I'll tell them you're harassing us, Rebecca said, but her voice lacked conviction. Daniel smiled without warmth. With what evidence? I have documentation. You have excuses. Option 2. You accept a formal trespass warning right now. I'm filing it with the police department today regardless of your choice, but if you accept it voluntarily, it stays civil. The warning legally prohibits you and your children from entering my property without explicit written permission. Violation allows me to have you arrested immediately for criminal trespassing. No more warnings. This is insane, Rebecca said. But she was looking at her children now, clearly calculating. Additionally, you reimburse me $700 for documented damages within 30 days. Cash or check. I have receipts for everything. And you sign a document acknowledging the trespassing incidents and agreeing to the restraining parameters. My attorney drafted it. It protects me if you try to claim harassment later. And if I do this, Rebecca asked quietly, then we're done. No restraining order, no small claims suit, no trespassing reports, unless you violate the warning. But understand this, Rebecca. I will be watching. Every camera stays active. Every boundary violation gets documented and reported immediately. You don't get to laugh this off or charm your way out. You crossed a line repeatedly, ignored polite requests, and forced me to treat you as a legal problem instead of a neighbor. Those consequences are permanent. Rebecca looked at her children, now standing in the shallow end, watching with wide eyes. She looked at Daniel's phone, still showing the paused video evidence. She looked at her own house, probably calculating whether fighting this was worth the risk to her career and custody arrangement. Fine, she said finally, voice tight. We'll sign your stupid document and stay away. But you're making a huge deal out of nothing. If it was nothing, Daniel said quietly, you would have stopped the first time I asked. He gestured toward his gate. Get your children out of my pool. I'll bring the paperwork to your house in 1 hour. Have $700 ready within 30 days. And Rebecca, this is the last time we have this conversation. The next time you cross my property line without written permission, I call the police and press charges. Test me if you want. I promise you won't like what happens. Rebecca gathered her children and her belongings in silence, her earlier confidence replaced with tight-lipped anger. As they filed out through his gate, Mason glanced back at Daniel with something that looked like new understanding. Rebecca didn't look back at all. Daniel watched them go, then allowed himself a small smile. For 5 weeks, he'd been treated like an obstacle to Rebecca's convenience. Now she understood what happened when you confused patience with powerlessness. The game had changed. And this time, Daniel was the one writing the rules. The document signing happened at 5:00 p.m. sharp. Daniel arrived at Rebecca's front door with printed copies of the trespass warning acknowledgement, the damage reimbursement agreement, and photographic evidence packets. Rebecca answered with her jaw set, clearly having spent the last hour oscillating between resentment and resignation. They sat at her dining room table in hostile silence while she read through every line, occasionally muttering about how excessive this all was. Daniel said nothing. He'd learned that her complaints were reflexive attempts to reframe herself as the victim. When she finally signed both documents, her signature was aggressive, pen pressed hard enough to indent the pages beneath. Daniel provided her with copies and tucked his originals into a folder that would go directly into a fireproof safe. "The money?" he asked simply. "I said 30 days, Rebecca snapped. "Actually, I said within 30 days. If you have it now, we settle it completely. If not, I expect payment by August 23rd. Not August 24th, the 23rd. Rebecca stood abruptly, left the room, and returned with her checkbook. She wrote the check with barely controlled fury, tore it out sharply, and thrust it at him. $700. Daniel took the check, examined it to ensure everything was correct, and nodded. "I'll deposit this tomorrow. If it bounces, the agreement is void, and I pursue all legal options I outlined. Understand?" "It won't bounce," Rebecca said icily. "Good." Daniel stood. "The trespass warning is now official. I'm filing it with the police department tonight. Officer Chen already reviewed my documentation and confirmed it's justified. If you or your children are caught on my property, even stepping 1 foot over the property line, I will call the police immediately and press charges for criminal trespassing. No conversation. No second chances. Just consequences." He walked toward her door, then paused. "You know what's interesting, Rebecca? I would have shared my pool if you'd asked respectfully. If you'd knocked on my door that first day and said, 'Hey, I'm your new neighbor. My kids love swimming,' would you ever consider letting them use your pool occasionally with supervision?" I probably would have said yes. Maybe one afternoon a week, scheduled in advance, with you supervising and cleaning up after. I'm not the selfish person you decided I was. Rebecca's expression flickered with something that might have been regret, but she said nothing. "But you didn't ask," Daniel continued. You assumed my property was yours to use, my boundaries were yours to ignore, my objections were yours to dismiss. You taught your children that if you want something, you just take it and laugh at anyone who objects. And when someone finally enforces consequences, you act like they're the problem. He opened her door. "I hope this teaches you something. For your kids' sake, if not your own." The next 3 weeks were blissfully quiet. Rebecca's Tesla came and went, but never once did Daniel's motion sensors alert him to activity in his backyard. He saw the children playing in their own yard occasionally, eyeing his pool with longing but never approaching the fence. Rebecca herself seemed to be avoiding even looking in his direction, hurrying from car to house whenever they crossed paths in their driveways. Then, on a Friday evening in early August, Daniel's doorbell rang. He answered to find Thomas Hartley, Rebecca's ex-husband, standing on his porch with an expression of profound embarrassment. "Mr. Foster, I'm Tom Hartley. I live in Seattle, but I'm visiting my kids this weekend. Rebecca told me what happened, and I wanted to apologize personally." Tom was in his mid-40s, wearing business-casual clothing and carrying himself with the uncomfortable posture of a man delivering an overdue apology. "She gave me her version, but I also called the police department and got the actual story from Officer Chen. I'm horrified." Daniel, surprised, invited him in. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Tom explained that Mason had told him the full story, including details Rebecca had omitted, like how she'd called Daniel uptight and encouraged the children to ignore his complaints because he wasn't using the pool anyway. Tom had immediately researched Daniel's legal rights and realized his ex-wife had put herself and their children at serious risk. "I've been on her for years about teaching the kids boundaries," Tom said wearily. She has this entitlement thing where she thinks charm and excuses get her out of anything. Usually they do. I'm glad someone finally held her accountable, even though I'm sorry you had to be the one dealing with it. How are the kids handling it? Daniel asked, genuinely curious. Mason's actually okay. He's old enough to understand they were wrong. He told me, Dad, we kept going into his yard even after he asked us to stop. That's not cool. Olivia's embarrassed. Cooper doesn't fully get it, but he knows they can't go to the pool anymore. Tom sighed. Rebecca's furious, of course. At you, at me, for not taking her side, at the situation. But her being mad doesn't make her right. The check cleared, Daniel said, and there haven't been any violations. As far as I'm concerned, if everyone stays on their side of the fence, we're done. Tom nodded gratefully. That's more than fair. And look, I know this is weird, but I'm in town one weekend a month. If there's ever any issue with the kids, call me. Here's my number. Rebecca needs to learn that actions have consequences, but the kids don't need to suffer because their mom has boundary issues. Daniel took the number, oddly touched by Tom's candor. After Tom left, Daniel stood at his back window looking at the pool, perfectly clean and undisturbed in the evening light. The water reflected the sunset. The deck was pristine. His space was his own again. The violation of those 5 weeks had taught him something valuable, that enforcing boundaries wasn't cruel, and that people who called you unreasonable for protecting what was yours were usually people benefiting from your failure to do so. 6 weeks later, on a crisp September morning, Daniel floated in his pool with his eyes closed. The water temperature perfect, the silence broken only by birdsong and the gentle hum of the filtration system. His phone, safely in a waterproof case on the deck, showed no alerts. The cameras still recorded everything, but these days they captured only leaves drifting across the property and the occasional rabbit hopping through the grass. He'd seen Rebecca once in the past month at the community mailboxes. She'd nodded stiffly and he'd nodded back. No words, no drama, just the cool acknowledgement of two people who'd reached a permanent understanding. Mason, interestingly, had surprised him 2 weeks earlier. The boy had been shooting basketball in his driveway when Daniel was checking his mailbox. Mason had called out, "Mr. Foster?" and jogged over. He'd apologized, genuinely looking Daniel in the eye, for the pool incidents and for being disrespectful. Daniel had accepted the apology and told Mason he appreciated his maturity. The kid had smiled with relief and jogged back to his driveway. It was a small moment, but it suggested something had actually been learned. Daniel had discovered that justice doesn't always look like dramatic courtroom victories or public humiliation. Sometimes justice is simply the restoration of peace. Sometimes it's teaching someone that no is a complete sentence. That documentation is more powerful than charm, and that patience isn't the same as passivity. As he floated there in his reclaimed sanctuary, Daniel reflected on how easily the situation could have escalated further. If Rebecca had violated the warning, if the check had bounced, if she'd tried to retaliate somehow, but she hadn't. The consequence of potentially losing her real estate license and facing custody. Complications had evidently been sufficient motivation to respect. Boundaries she'd previously treated as suggestions. He'd learned something, too, that being nice meant nothing if it enabled bad behavior. That sometimes the kindest thing you could do, for yourself and even for the other person, was enforce consequences. Rebecca might be angry, but her children were learning that actions have results. That other people's property isn't yours to take, and that ignoring someone's boundaries eventually backfires. Daniel climbed out of the pool as the morning sun warmed his shoulders, water sluicing off his skin. His workspace beckoned. He had code to write, systems to secure, problems to solve. But for just a moment longer, he stood at the edge of his deck, looking at the property he'd defended, and smiled. Because justice, whether delivered through courtroom drama or simply through the quiet enforcement of boundaries, was equally satisfying. And sometimes, the most powerful victories were the ones where you simply got to keep what was already yours. Across the country in Boulder, Colorado, retired environmental lawyer Margaret Chen was tending her native plant garden when her HOA president served her with a violation notice for unapproved landscaping. Margaret, who'd spent 30 years defending conservation cases against Fortune 500 companies, set down her trowel and read the notice with the careful attention she'd once reserved for corporate depositions. The HOA covenant, she noted, predated the Colorado Native Plant Protection Act she'd helped write. "You know," she said to the president with a smile that had once made oil executives nervous, "I'd be fascinated to see how you enforce covenants that contradict state environmental law." "Please continue making demands in writing." The president's confident expression wavered.